And just to note, this is a recorded session. We will be posting this. If you want to change your name on Slack or on Zoom or go off camera, that's completely fine. So thank you all again for joining us for Bridges Not Walls, Histories, Stories, Strategies from the Frontlines of Anti-Detention Advocacy. During our time today, we'll have an overview of migrant carceral history, a little bit about Japanese American incarceration, some information from Migrant, New Jersey, and then we'll learn a little bit more about the fight today and close it out with a Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, we can do this at the end during our Q&A period. If you want to ask questions anonymously, you can DM those directly to Shira Cruz. And if you want to introduce yourself in the chat box, you can add name, pronouns, organization, and township. So this is a really important webinar given what's going on in the country, and especially in New Jersey, where there are attempts to make this sort of the hub of detention in the Northeast. So this is an incredibly pertinent conversation. We're so grateful to be joined today by some speakers who are true experts in this work. Sure. So we're really looking forward to this conversation today, and then wrapping it up with sort of what's the state of New Jersey right now? What are things that we can do? And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brianna Nofil. Brianna is an assistant professor of history at William & Mary, where she teaches courses on immigration, borders, and policing in modern U.S. history. She received her PhD from Columbia University, and her first book, The Migrant's Jail, An American History of Mass Incarceration, was published by Princeton University Press in 2024 and tells the century-long story of migrant detention and resistance in city and county jails. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bree. Thank you.
Unmuting. Okay, can you hear me? Can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome.
I hear you.
Okay. Thank you to Danielle so much for organizing this, and thank you for having me. I am a huge admirer of your work, and it's just a thrill to be here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the history of how we got to the detention and deportation system that we have today. And I'm going to talk about what I think are hopefully some useful tools for understanding Delaney Hall and understanding sort of the broader detention landscape in New Jersey in historical context. So this is a chart of the average daily population in immigration detention. It goes from 1947, which is the first year that the US government actually reports this number for, but definitely not the first year that they're detaining immigrants. And this chart is from my book, so it goes through 2022. So it's already like phenomenally out of date. The most recent numbers coming out of ICE suggest that they are now detaining about 50,000. They've broken the 50,000 mark in terms of how many people are being detained at night. So this end of the graph is going to go way up. So immigration detention has been around for as long as the United States has had restrictive immigration laws. I'm going to talk in a minute about sort of the roots of the immigration detention system in the 1880s and 90s, which really is born out of Chinese exclusion. But as you can see from this chart, the scale of detention over the last 30 to 40 years is really remarkable and really unprecedented. So the private prison companies like Geo Group, which is running Delaney Hall, they are very much born out of this moment in the 80s and 90s where there is this absolutely surging government demand for detention space. And that is due to a number of reasons, but some of the biggest ones are that the United States is going to start detaining all asylum seekers as well as sort of expanding the number of criminal offenses that lead to a mandatory immigration detention. But what I want to focus on today is the way that revenue and money making has been at the heart of migrant incarceration from its sort of earliest incarnations. So as many of you know, the sort of eye-popping number for the Delaney Hall contract is it's $1 billion contract over the next 15 years. But I want to think about sort of the longer histories of how Detention has always been a project to commoditize migrants for revenue. And I also want to think about how this project has always relied on local governments, not just private prison companies, in order to sort of make mass deportation possible. So the sort of ways that mass deportation relies on localities is, part of the reason why the 2021 law that kept ICE out of New Jersey jails is so critical, and why ICE has gone to such tremendous lengths to try to thwart that. Okay, so immigration detention is deeply intertwined with the longer, larger history of racist immigration law in this country, and it is particularly sort of has its foundations in the federal government's push to bar Asian and at least initially Chinese in particular migration to the United States. So this is the earliest example of immigration detention that I've found in my research. What you're seeing here is that this is a jail logbook. It is from a rural community right along the US-Canadian border, Essex County, and it's from 1901, so really early. And it's a remarkable source in a number of ways. But this is the records of the sheriff of this community who is marking each Chinese migrant that he is detaining on behalf of the Immigration Service in his county jail. So it's a remarkable source for a number of reasons. The photos, we can see how long the detentions were. The detentions here were about 5 months on average, which is far, far longer than they were at places like Ellis Island and Angel Island. But it's also a really important source because it shows us how, from sort of its earliest versions, detention is transforming and remaking local economies. So observers in these rural communities along the northern border, along the southern border, they note with some surprise that sheriffs in these communities are really eager to be in the migrant detention business because it offers them a rare opportunity to earn federal money. So the basic arrangement for most of the 20th century is that the Immigration Service does not have significant detention space of its own. So if it wants to detain someone en route to deportation, typically what they do is they call up a local sheriff and they say, can we rent space in the city or county jail? So these sheriffs are getting paid per night for each person that they detain in the local sort of carceral facility. And this exact same arrangement persists to this day. It is a major way that ICE finds detention space. Um, so what we see in these rural communities is they're going to start investing money into building more detention space because they want more opportunities to get this money from the federal government. So in rural New York, these counties are each going to build what they'll call a separate segregated Chinese jail, which is a jail specifically for use by the Immigration Service. So these towns absolutely do not want Chinese residents, right? But they see the Chinese prisoner as filling a distinct social and economic role in their communities. Okay. So over the decades that follow, detention is going to take many different forms and it is going to target many different communities. So I'm going to talk just briefly about a few of these forms. So county jails are going to continue to kind of be the backbone of the immigration detention system. The big advantage of using county jails for the Immigration Service is that it essentially gives them a footprint in every American community. Most towns have a jail, so it really expands the Immigration Service's ability to deport and their sort of geographic reach. As you can see here, of course, this is not just sort of restrained to the northeast. We are going to see massive contracts doled out along the southern border. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we're going to see that many of these communities are going to start building bigger jails because they hope the Immigration Service contracts with them. So there is a financial incentive to build more carceral space that is being fueled by deportation and immigration law enforcement. So detention isn't just sort of emerging out of mass incarceration, it is propelling carceral expansion across the 20th century. So another tool and strategy the Immigration Service is going to use is detaining folks in just regular office buildings. This is 630 Sansom Street. It is a office building in downtown San Francisco. throughout the 1950s, the Immigration Service is going to detain hundreds of mostly war brides, so women, mostly Chinese women who are marrying American servicemen, are going to be detained here while the US is investigating them. So, the story is that sort of no one or very few people in San Francisco even realize that this is happening, that this very sort of nondescript office building has been turned into a detention center, until this series of episodes, as you can see in this little news clipping, where women climb to the roof of this office building and threaten to jump. And the newspapers describe these sort of just throngs and crowds of office workers watching this scene unfold, and people really registering, right, for the first time that this too is a migrant incarceration site. It's also worth noting that ICE continues to operate out of this building today. Okay. And then lastly, the other, I think, really important model we start to see is that the US government is going to start experimenting with this idea of running its own detention camps. So this is McAllen Detention Camp. It's right along the border. It's going to be used for these sort of massive post-war deportations of Mexican workers, the same Mexican workers that the US courted and relied upon so heavily during wartime. This site is just, it's fascinating for many reasons, but to connect to what Danielle is going to talk about next, it's also important because this, you can see these barracks, right? This is the physical infrastructure of Japanese American incarceration. So the Immigration Service takes the same barracks that it is using several towns over at Crystal City to detain Japanese and Japanese Americans. It moves it to McAllen and it uses that same infrastructure as the sort of the infrastructure of mass deportation. So I think it's a good reminder of just sort of how flexible these carceral spaces are and how they can really be reused and reappropriated for sort of whatever project of racial control that the state deems most pressing. I also really like this to show this quote. This is from a local newspaper near McAllen that is talking about the rise of these detention camps, and I'll read it to you. They're thinking about how they sort of built a bigger jail because the Immigration Service asked them to, but they say now they're running this camp, so they're not going to need our jail. So it says now apparently Texas towns are stuck with big jails and nobody to put in them but each other. The Immigration Service and Border Patrol prefer a concentration camp of their own. So I think it's a really powerful line, not only because of the invocation of concentration camps, but also because it sort of shows, right, that people understand that we built a giant jail. They told us it would be for non-citizens. But now, right, who's going to be in it is probably going to be people from this community. Again, these spaces are incredibly, incredibly flexible. All right, so I'll just take a few more minutes. So these private prison companies are going to become major players in the 80s as the US's demand for detention space expands. They are going to promise the federal government that they can build detention space faster, quieter, cheaper. Okay, and the US is going to buy into that. I think it's important to note that these companies, such as Corrections Corporation of America, immigration detention are the first contracts they are going to get. So immigration detention is really the test for the model of private prison companies to see if it works before they sort of allow them to move into the incarceration of citizens. So it's a big open question for people on both, both Republicans and Democrats have big questions about whether private prisons are a good idea. There's going to be a number of major scandals involving private prison companies in the 90s. One of the most notable happens in Elizabeth, New Jersey. It is sort of a story not dissimilar to what is happening today, where the federal government wants sort of a big hub of detention for people who are coming through New York City airports, particularly asylum seekers. So a company called Esmore Corrections is going to get this contract at a price so low that even Geo Group says there's no way they could possibly provide service at this low of a rate. It's the lowest bid, they get the contract. There is a massive uprising of detained people in 1995. In the wake of this uprising, the federal government investigates and they sort of say, it's horrific, right? It is sort of unimaginably horrific. Even the government can't stand behind it. But one of the things that I think privatization allows the government to do over and over again is they're able to say, right, this was an exceptionally bad contractor. We are going to we're going to move people out of this site. We're going to cut ties with this company. But it sort of prevents them from actually interrogating the sort of root of the system itself. It always allows the government to kind of pass the buck rather than saying these are structural problems. So in the wake of this uprising, these sort of hundreds of migrants are dispersed again to local jails, to private or to publicly run facilities. So again, does not really lead to decarceration. It just leads to this sort of endless shuffle of people around this really patchwork system. So many people sort of question if private prison companies can even survive the 1990s. They have so many controversies, but their fates are really going to change with 9/11. There's a very famous quote here from the chairman of another private prison company where he basically says, immigration detention is our industry now, right? Post 9/11, we see this as being kind of the hub of what we do. This is where the money is. This is where the contracts are going to be. Okay, so to end, I think this is probably mostly an audience that knows this, but this is an absolutely massive industry today. It is a massive industry for private prison companies. It is a massive industry for the hundreds of other contractors that are adjacent to these sites. But it is also just a major revenue generator for many American communities that get money from ICE for incarcerating migrants. Many of which, particularly in places like rural Louisiana, have jails that could not stay open if they were not renting this space to ICE. So the Immigration Service, both historically and today, has insulated itself from accountability through these nesting dolls of contracts and subcontracts and transfers and dispersed facilities. And it is a system that has dramatically expanded incarceration for non-citizens and citizens alike. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I learned so much too, just even knowing that the same infrastructure from Crystal City was used at this detention camp in Texas. It's just, it goes to show how how nefarious and I think you said flexible they are with this work. So I realized I don't think I introduced myself at the top, but I'm Danielle. I'm the director of organizing with AAPI New Jersey. I'm also a Yonsei, which means I'm fourth generation Japanese American. And I do have family that was incarcerated during World War II. My grandmother was 12 years old when she and her family were taken from their homes and, in big air quotes, relocated. They were sent to Pinedale Assembly Center and then off to Tule Lake and Minidoka camps. And so Japanese American incarceration, this is when the president passed Executive Order 9066, which you can see in the top right corner of the photo here. This instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, where they took Japanese Americans from their homes, primarily along the West Coast, and then again relocated them to various incarceration camps throughout the country, in the West Coast, Midwest, and in the South as well. So they took 120,000 Japanese Americans and also Japanese Latin Americans. And I think this is a group that's often forgotten about in conversations around incarceration, where they took Japanese folks from Latin America to the United States and placed them in these. And of those 120,000 Japanese Americans, about 2/3 had citizenship. So this is a huge sticking point in terms of a civil rights violation. That these were U.S. citizens. They, all habeas corpus. So what is habeas corpus? That was fully stripped on them. They did not have any process here, and so they were incarcerated in these camps for the duration of World War II. And a lot of these folks, especially before the executive order came out, were detained under the Alien Enemies Act. And this is a huge sticking point today because that's being used by the Trump administration to try to detain Venezuelan nationals. So it's been interesting to see the connections between the Alien Enemies Act being invoked during World War II and then again today. And I don't want to take up too much time because we have some other incredible speakers here, but I think what's so important with what Bree shared about sort of the first migrants incarcerated being Chinese nationals, and then we're seeing this with Japanese American, and then we'll hear next from Migrant with Filipino Americans, but sometimes Asian Americans, I think, forget that this is such an important issue to our community. And we need to be standing in solidarity with other organizations, other communities that are impacted today because one in five undocumented immigrants in New Jersey is Asian. And that is actually higher than the national average. So I think from the stories that you're hearing today, it's just a reminder for the Asian American community in particular that we need to be part of this fight. We need to be standing alongside other organizers to really make sure that what's happened to our communities does not continue to happen in the way that we're seeing across the country and here in New Jersey. So with that, I will turn it over to Ruthie from Migrante, New Jersey, formerly known as the Filipino Immigrants and Workers Organizing Project. It is a mass organization of Filipino migrant workers and their families who seek to educate, organize, and mobilize low-income and working-class Filipino families in New Jersey. Ruthie, I'll just probably want to hit next, and I'll get that for you on the slideshow.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and thank you so much to AAPI New Jersey also for inviting us and giving us this space to also share about our work. And it's been incredible to also share and learn really from my fellow panelists. So thank you. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Ruthie. I am based here in Jersey City, and I am also the vice chairperson of Migrante USA. So Migrante is we are just one chapter out of the many chapters that is all over the world, actually, of Filipino workers, because there's so many Filipinos outside of the Philippines. There's over 10 million Filipinos outside of the Philippines and contribute so much to actually the economy of the Philippines as well. So that's why we started the Migrante, the organization and the alliance globally, because of the need to help our fellow kababayans, our compatriots, our Filipinos that are essentially abandoned in all over the world and not having the support of the Philippine government. So we're here in New Jersey, in Jersey City, and we've also fought for the rights and welfare and also of Filipino migrants, whether that's because of labor trafficking, because of wage theft, because of detention in the different facilities here in New Jersey. So we are also founded by survivors of labor trafficking. So if you saw the picture in the slide, oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. The one on the right is the Florida 15. A little misnomer because actually they're here in Jersey City now, but when they were trafficked, they're hotel workers. They worked in Florida at a hotel in Florida, but they found flyer actually and news about organizing of Filipinos here in New Jersey. And so we helped them essentially escape from that situation. And after that, they decided that, there's so many more Filipinos that experience the same issue of labor trafficking. And so they wanted to start Migrant in New Jersey. They're based here now in New Jersey. Okay. Another photo we just came from very important assembly of different Filipino organizations and Migrante chapters all over the US. So there's about like 400 of us that came together, and we were so grateful that Shira and AAPI New Jersey actually supported us. It was pretty historic because we heard the different fights of the Filipino migrant workers all over the country. Okay. So so this is Migrant International. We can skip this one. This just happened. So one of the reasons that really we see a lot of Filipinos leave the country is because of the economic reasons. The situation in the Philippines is there's not much industry in the Philippines, and so it's hard to find jobs. People that go to college can't find jobs either in their fields. So those that are nurses, those that are teachers, they seek, to go outside the country to find jobs. Those that are also caregivers, domestic workers, they do the same. They can't find any jobs that are that could give them a living, so they come out and risk their lives. Really, sometimes, usually, actually, they don't have papers. They decide to risk their lives and find new opportunities outside, and see if they could find an employer. So the risk that happens is, like they come to a new place, they don't know anyone, and usually they also don't know the laws. And so sometimes they are, like they are fooled into paying a lot of money. And to agencies just so that they could go out of the country. So here in the U.S., there's about 4 million Filipinos that are here, and many of them are also undocumented. Next slide, please. So throughout the years since our founding, these are some of the things that we have been involved in, specifically on the detention fight, anti-deportation fights. When we were still starting, when we were learning how to really support fellow Filipinos, we did more so like going to visit. We worked with First Friends and AFSC actually here in Jersey to hear about, like, who are the Filipinos that are detained. We had visitations in Elizabeth Detention Center before, just to learn about their conditions and the stories of, like, how did the Filipinos end up here anyway. And from there, we worked with the different organizations to also create a case to make sure that the Filipino detained Filipinos were also freed, right? And so that was especially the case in the first Trump administration. So you'll see some of the victories that we had here of Kuya Ron, which is, sorry, I don't think I can point, but some Filipinos that we were able to work with, Lourdes, Kuya Ron, Chris Orque, Ate Christy, all of them really ended up in the facility because of some petty crimes, nonviolent crimes that they've served already, but then they were still picked up by ICE. So because of it was also drug-related crimes that they were that they had. And so during this time, the president of the Philippines was Rodrigo Duterte, and he was really waging this drug war against poor people, planting drugs on other people, or just like really a lot of impunity and fascism, which is very similar to what we're seeing now with that's happening, here in the US also, the fascism and impunity. So a lot of the migrants that we worked with were granted asylum or asylum to stay here because of that situation in the Philippines, that they feared for their life. If they go back to the Philippines, they will be killed because of these drug-related crimes that they have been slapped on, essentially. So so that was essentially like the campaigning that we were doing. We were still learning about really the detention, what a business it was, the profit that it really makes, and how people are just like really, if you fill beds, they make money off of that. And so many different reasons that people shouldn't really be there to begin with, but it's really about the profit. So through working with the other organizations and us working directly with the detained migrants and their families, we were able to really free some of the migrants and also continue to build this movement, for different rights of migrants. So other things that we learned there, because now, right, it's again Trump 2.0. We've seen, again, the importance of us working and campaigning directly with the migrant families before. And then, but we didn't have really this public campaign. And we learned that actually a public campaign is really important to reach more people. And also seeing that the responsibility really of Filipinos in like why asking the question of like why are Filipinos here to begin with, and how the Philippine government really continues to abandon its people, and actually is colluding with the U.S. government and allowing, like the Filipino people to be part of this system, right? They don't provide any sort of support. The very limited support that they give is because we had to push them to like, can you visit your citizen? They have been unjustly detained. For example, Denmark and Jovi was a recent case. They were certified nursing assistants in Ocean County here in New Jersey. They were defending themselves on a shift, and they were essentially jailed because of that. And they were granted to be released by the judge after many months of being in Ocean County Jail. But then right after that, there was collusion that happened between the Ocean County and ICE, because they were picked up immediately by ICE and sent to Elizabeth Detention Center, where they stayed for another month before they were sent to Massachusetts and the Massachusetts greater Boston area, essentially. So we know that that was, like for many years, different organizations have also been pushing for the Immigrant Trust Act, right? And working on that to codify the Immigrant Trust Directive. And this case essentially was a violation of that. Like there should be no collusion between ICE and our government, but that's exactly what they did. And so the fight for the Immigrant Trust Act now is also really important, and the work that our other organizations that we work with needs to continue. So yeah, so that's kind of like the face of like the fight now of the Filipino migrant workers. Because for Migrant in New Jersey, we don't want to just stop at, like really the immediate need now, right? Like here, we want to really also work with the families and many other Filipinos, and not just those that are detained, to explain like why are we leaving the country to begin with? Because if people really had the choice, they wouldn't leave their home countries. They would stay there. But because of that economic need, or even like political situation and reasons, they're forced to go out of the country. And so when we fight for like these tactical fights that we have to wage alongside the many people here that are affected by these like really fascist regime, we also want to fight for also the liberation of the Philippines, right? Because aside from the lack of jobs in the Philippines, there's also the threat of war that's happening also in Southeast Asia, right? Between the US and China. And so we want to make sure that, like people that are being forced out of their countries are, we don't want war at all. We want peace everywhere. And so we want to make sure that our Filipino people here know, that there's a fight to liberate the Philippines and fight for a better future for everyone. So, yeah, that's what I would like to share. And maybe I think the last slide is if you would like to get involved and get in contact with any of these organizations, the Migrant in New Jersey, or be part of the Tanggal Migrante Network, here is our information. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Ruthie. I think you kept emphasizing a key question to why are people leaving? And I think if we look at the history of, U.S. involvement in imperialism in so many of these other countries, that begs the question of what does that root cause? And I love that you mentioned the Immigrant Trust Act. I think that's a fantastic segue into our next speaker, Amy, the Executive Director of the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice. NJAIJ, they are really at the forefront of the fight right now. They are the state's largest immigration coalition, and with their member organizations, fight for policies that empower and protect immigrant New Jerseyans. I'm just so much in awe of this organization, all the work that Amy and her team have been doing. They just do really incredible things for New Jerseyans, for immigrants, for APIs. And so I'm really pleased to have them join us today. So With that, I'll turn it over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Danielle. And thank you so much, everyone, for having me here today. Happy Pride, happy Immigrant Heritage Month. Would it be okay if I share a screen? Cool. So I am really honored to be here on behalf of the Alliance to talk a little bit about New Jersey and where we are at the epicenter of Trump's mass detention and deportation agenda. There's a lot going on in New Jersey, and I think often when most Americans think about, oh, I don't know why this isn't loading. There we go. I think when a lot of Americans think about immigration states, they think, oh, that's a California thing, or in Arizona or Florida or Texas or New York. Those are like the immigration states. But it's really New Jersey that is second in the nation for a proportion of immigrants to our total population. New Jersey was also the first place under the new Trump administration to experience a mass workplace raid. We experienced that even before Secretary Noem was confirmed. And as we'll talk about today, and others have already alluded to, New Jersey is the site of President Trump's first new detention center since he's returned to the White House. So in many ways, we are the epicenter of the mass detention system, and there's a risk that it's going to get even greater. And we are the entry point toward the mass deportation agenda. So before I jump in, I just really like folks to, I know this is like something that's fallen out of practice, but land acknowledgements are something that I think are really important in the immigrant justice movement. Borders are so often defined by those that sit in power. And in the United States, that has always meant a white supremacist organization. And so as we think about things like detention or who gets detained or who gets paperwork, who has lawfulness or who has status or who has, who is stateless. This is so grounded in recognizing that borders have always been arbitrary. And if we are going to try to fight against systems that weaponize borders, we also must fundamentally recognize that we sit on borders that have changed over time and are rooted in racism and colonialism. So just sharing a quick Northeast map of the many borders that are part of our heritage here. And of course, many of the places we come from also have their own political borders versus their places that are part of our identity. So quickly, I'm going to cover a few things in the course of our conversation. One is something that several speakers have already talked about, is that immigration law and criminal law are not the same thing. I also want to do a quick look back on just how we got to where we are today. I'm going to talk about two big evil corporations, CoreCivic and Geo Group, and what our fight looks like ahead. So first, immigration law is not criminal law. It looks a lot like it, though. My dog is not a fan of either. But even though we see immigration officers, sorry. Okay, I'm really sorry. Let me move into a quiet place. Even though immigration officers wear armed uniforms like criminal legal officers do, even though immigration jails are high security like the criminal legal jails and prisons that we see, that does not mean that their legal systems operate the same way. And as you heard our friends from Migrant, they say in the cases of Denmark and Jovi, there are instances where the criminal legal system will drop charges or dismiss cases, or even in instances where maybe you completely served your sentence and you paid your debt to society, but you will still be entrapped, or often we call this doubly punished by the immigration system, and you may end up in detention again, and there is no way to get you out. Unlike a case that can go on appeal, you have to appeal your immigration case, but you are detained and incarcerated because of your past contact with the criminal legal system. So immigration law really takes the ceiling
of our criminal legal system, which again, our criminal legal system sets a very, very low bar and threshold for what true justice looks like. But immigration law uses that low bar as its ceiling. So it's an extremely arbitrary system that is not ruled on rightness or wrongness. A lot of issues of detention and deportation are at the discretion of immigration officers themselves or immigration judges who are not the same and who do not have the same qualifications as judges in the criminal legal system. So I just share that because I think within the immigrant community, there are a lot of feelings of, well, I came the right way, or my community always does things right, right? We did it this way, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, but that's simply not true. A lot of the systems that we have in our immigration system today are things that were not penalized in past generations or past waves of immigration. And often the stories that we've been told from parents or grandparents are actually stories that would probably lead them to immigration detention today if they had migrated at this time. So to jump into looking back, I just want to share a site that we felt was really helpful to put together as we talk to people about the history of immigration detention in New Jersey. It's on our site at /ICE out of NJ. And we have a timeline with some, major milestones over the last few years of what has happened with immigration here in New Jersey. But just to give you a quick grounding, I want to show you this map of Lower Manhattan, which you can see on the right. This is where the immigration court is in New York. So you may remember mayoral candidate Brad Lander was recently arrested after he was accompanying someone to their case at the immigration court there in Lower Manhattan. Here in this map of Lower Manhattan and New Jersey, there's a red dot on the Hudson County Jail. This was a county jail that was that's owned and operated by the county, but was contracting with the federal government for immigration detention. The image below that is Bergen County Jail that was doing the same thing. They were leasing part of their jail to the federal government for the purposes of immigration detention. And Essex County Jail, which is not on the map, but if you were to, zoom one scale out of Google, you would see it. It was the other county jail that was contracting with the federal government. In 2020, after decades of fighting against immigration detention expansion, 2020 was a period of time where New Jersey had the nation's largest instances of COVID death and infection rates in its jails and prisons. And that was true of immigration jails as well. Folks came together to create a ban on immigration contracts, whether they were run by private facilities or whether they were run by public contractors like county jails or state jails. And that law passed in summer of 2021. But before the bill was signed into law, Elizabeth Detention Center, which is the one on the right, you can see someone blocked out the name of Elizabeth Detention Center to spell abolish ICE. This is like one of my favorite pictures of all time. But Elizabeth Detention Center, which was the only private facility in New Jersey at the time, extended its contract. So basically the legislature passed the bill. Governor Murphy didn't sign it. Within that time, they renewed their contract, and then Governor Murphy signed the bill into law. So Elizabeth was, for a short period of time, able to continue their contract because they had signed it before the bill became law, which meant that Elizabeth Detention Center for a period of a couple years was the only ICE facility in New Jersey, and was expected to close, which was a huge victory for communities that had been fighting against these sites for a really long time. But in the last year of their contract extension, essentially the time at which they would then fall under the 2021 law, CoreCivic filed a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey saying that it was discriminatory against them and that it violated the US Constitution because it was discriminating against the federal government. That case was actually joined by the Biden administration, and the Biden DOJ sided with CoreCivic to say, yes, we want to continue operating private ICE jails all throughout the country, and we think we have the authority to do so, even if states want to regulate that industry or regulate that business. So it's sort of parallel to thinking about, let's say you wanted to ban like dangerous chemical factories in your state, and the government said, well, actually, we need to contract dangerous chemicals for all the bombs that we make, so we're going to just appropriate your land and do it anyway. That's essentially the argument that they were making for CoreCivic with Elizabeth Detention Center. So what happened was that judge, who was a Republican his entire life until January 7th, 2021, you of course remember what happened on January 6th, but he was appointed to his position later in 2021. He ruled on the side of CoreCivic and struck down the private provision of the ban, essentially saying counties and the state cannot contract with ICE, but private prison companies can, and they can do it wherever they want. The case is now on appeal. We took many of you down, recognizing names and, of course, sister organizations on the call to Philadelphia when the case was appealed, and it's still waiting decision before a panel of 3 judges. So we don't know if those judges will uphold the original 2021 law, which means that when the contract at Elizabeth Detention Center does expire, they'll be forced to close. Or those judges might rule on the same side as the previous judge and say, yeah, you can't regulate this industry because it's a necessary operation of the federal government. So we're still awaiting that decision. It's probably going to be a couple months more, but it has huge repercussions here in New Jersey because, of course, Elizabeth Detention Center still operates. And now we have a huge facility in Newark called Delaney Hall. Could I get a quick show of hands? Like, who has heard of Delaney Hall in the past few months? Yeah, a few people, maybe a few people that are not. Yeah, now there's more hands being raised. Yeah, so Delaney Hall has become sort of like a household name, especially after May 9th, when Mayor Baraka was arrested for trying to join a congressional oversight visit. CoreCivic, who we talked about at Elizabeth Detention Center, is the world's largest private prison corporation. GEO is like the second. And they joined the lawsuit that CoreCivic filed to say, look, if CoreCivic can continue doing business, we should be allowed to open new business. They said that they wanted to open Delaney Hall. And so the city of Newark started watching for any permits or certifications that they would file because they wanted to be able to challenge them and provide strict oversight. But GEO Group never did. And then they announced on May 1st that they're opening. So this came as a huge surprise to everyone because if there's any business that you're going to open in a city, you need to give a heads up first and get some necessary permits. GEO Group, of course, didn't do that. And instead, they signed a contract that has a value of over $1 billion for a period of 15 years to open Delaney Hall, which was previously an overflow jail for Essex County, then briefly became an ICE jail in the early 2010s until people started dying, and also they were misclassifying officers, so they owed wage overtime hours that they couldn't pay, and they sold the facility to GEO Group. GEO Group then operated it as a halfway house and mandatory substance treatment center, and then it sat vacant for a very long time. So I just give that quick background because we talked earlier about how the infrastructure of immigration, the immigration system and the infrastructure of the mass incarceration system are 2 sides of the same coin. They just get passed back and forth. So if we're going to fight against one, we have to fight against all of it. That's how Delaney Hall came to be, and it's how it continues to exist today. So Prior to May 1st, advocates gathered in front of Delaney Hall to call for its closure. The city of Newark filed some lawsuits to say, look, we're going to put a stop work order on this place. They're not going to be allowed to open. But they opened anyway, and they had armed officers preventing city officials from going inside. The picture on the bottom right is some of the citations that the city of Newark was issuing every single day from May 1st up until now. They're still issuing citations. But remember, this is one of the largest private prison corporations in the world. They can pay a citation like you or I could lose a penny. It doesn't matter to them. But the city was doing what it could do at most within its authority, resulting in congressional leaders coming for a visit to Delaney Hall to understand how many people were inside, how were they being treated, how full was the facility. No one had been inside aside from Geo Group employees and the people that they were holding in detention. When those congressional leaders went to visit, this happened. They attempted to arrest Mayor Baraka as he was leaving the facility. There then became a really, really violent melee where officers were pushing, you know, 80-plus-year-old Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman. She was being protected by Congresswoman LaMonica McIver and Congressman Menendez. Mayor Baraka, of course, as you know, was then arrested. His charges were later dropped, but charges were brought against Representative LaMonica McIver, who's now facing felony charges and upwards of 16 years in jail. So it's really, there's so much that you can say about this incident. Like I'm just looking at the pictures again now, and I like see an officer like holding his firearm. Like it's really scary. These are Congress members that they're doing this to. But it really underscores that when ICE enters community, it inherently becomes violent. Having armed officers inherently invites violence. It invites escalation. And nothing could be more clear than what happened to our three Congress members and the mayor of Newark. I know I'm running quick on time and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So I'm going to just point folks to that ICE out of NJ website. But I do want to say that there's a lot more that's happening on detention in New Jersey. We know that Union County Jail is, Union County commissioners are looking to sell their jail, and we think the only person who's likely to buy it is a private prison corporation like CoreCivic or Geo Group. Elizabeth Detention Center, which is, less than a mile away as the crow flies, also just extended its contract for a period of 4 months. We think that they may be one of the buyers for Union County Jail. And Fort Dix, down in South Central Jersey, we know that that was used as an open-air refugee resettlement camp and has been named by the Trump administration as a possible site for an open-air ICE detention facility, similar to those that we see along the southern border, the tent encampments that are holding people outside. So there's a lot to do on the fight for anti-detention expansion. And the ugly truth is we might not ever close Delaney Hall, or if we do, we might not be able to stop Union County Jail from opening as an ICE facility, or we might not be able to stop Elizabeth Detention Center from continuing. But what we can do is prevent the number of people who end up in ICE's hands to begin with. We know that the very politicized appointee, Alina Habba, has made immigration her central issue to punish the state of New Jersey. She's, of course, the one that is also bringing the charges against LaMonica McIver. She's announced something called Operation Apex Hammer in New Jersey, which is very similar to what the state of Massachusetts experienced over the last few months. So you may remember those like widespread TV headlines of students getting arrested by plainclothes officers and officers storming campuses across Massachusetts. That same operation is now becoming active in New Jersey, which means that, more people are going to end up in detention and on the way toward deportation unless we do something. And that something is a QR code that, of course, I've forgotten to put in here. So let me stop sharing this and let me share another one. But we would love you to take action on the Immigrant Trust Act, which would fundamentally draw lines between what local and state police are allowed to do, and what their responsibility is if federal officers ask them to participate in immigration enforcement. Right now, it's at their discretion. If they want to cooperate with federal officers, there are things that they can argue to allow them to do so, which I think is terrible. It's what caused the self-deportations and the detentions of Denmark and Jovi. I'm just sharing the QR here quickly. But we really, need to draw a bright line between what New Jersey can and should do when it comes to responding to the mass deportation agenda. Please take action on the Immigrant Trust Act. It's something that's so, so important to our communities. Both the Democratic nominee for governor and the Republican nominee for governor have said that this is something they do not support, which is really terrifying that we're about to face another 4 years of governors who will not stand up for immigrant communities. And we have, at minimum, 3.5, maybe more if he establishes martial law and takes over everything of the Trump administration. So having the Immigrant Trust Act now is something that we really, really need to get passed. And I know I'm coming up against time, so I'll pass it back over to our moderators. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing all this information and also for opening up your section with the land acknowledgement. Super important to recognize, and Indigenous communities are actually most likely to face this kind of police brutality and violence. And I actually was in touch with a poet who had shared with me when she had read an op-ed I wrote about Japanese American incarceration and reparations, that her family on the reservation they grew up in was right next door to one of these Japanese American incarceration sites. And so it is also very close to her heart. I thank you so much for ending with information about the Immigrant Trust Act, because we do have a question, which is, what can people do right now? This is such a dire situation. It's a historical situation. It's one that we're going to keep fighting. Immigrant Trust Act is absolutely a fantastic way to get involved. But what are other things that community members can do, either in person or also virtually as well, to help fight this rise of migrant detention and deportation?
So, in person, between right now and June 30th is the most important time to get in touch with your state lawmaker. You really should do that because they're about to sign the state budget, which will determine some immigration legal services. So call them and ask them, are you going to pass the Immigrant Trust Act? Are you going to fund immigration legal services? They really, really need to hear from you. They've heard from folks like us on the call a lot. So even when we call in, they're just kind of like, okay. But if they hear from you, we have like 20 people on the call. If they start hearing from 20 people and you start telling, a handful of friends, it's going to build into something. So that's the most important. 2 is we'd really love you to give to organizations that are maybe not the organizations that you're seeing on the fore of TikTok or Instagram, but organizations like First Friends that provide bond and commissary. The only way that we're able to find information about what's happening at Delaney Hall or Elizabeth Detention Center is because people are getting commissary money to place a phone call out to their lawyers or to their family members. So I'll drop that link in chat. First Friends is doing such amazing work, and it's invisible. They're not doing the social media splashes. They're not, they are out there protesting all the time, but they're not sort of like the first organization banner that you'll see, but they are the first number that people in detention call. So I'll drop their link in just a second.
Thanks, Amy. And Ruthie, I know you shared information about how to get involved with Migrant as well. Is there anything else you want to share?
Yeah, I think just really join organizations, get involved. It's really anyone has, like a ability to contribute, whether that's, time or donate finances. that's really all helpful. Find an organization near you and educate yourself. I think that would be really a big help already. Yeah.
Thank you. And Bree, did you want to add anything as well from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that so much of this local work is just so important. I think that right, the system has proliferated for a lot of reasons, but it is by design that it is so hard to see, right? It always strikes me when we talk about it, just like how many different spaces it is taking place in. And it is, it is very intentional that people can disappear in this system and that these places are often really out of the way. So much of um so much of what I think is important here is just the ways that this activism is sort of making these spaces harder to ignore, and just putting them on people's radar.
Thank you. And I know we are at time. If you have to hop off, thank you so much for joining us. If you do have a minute, we do have another question, which is about Amy. I think this might be a question for you as opposed to answer, just in terms of the ITA and sort of where it stands between, they did specifically name the Attorney General and Mikey, and I think if you can share any information about sort of the legal.
Yeah, I think Representative Cheryl has, first of all, never in her congressional capacity had the best record on immigration. I don't think it's something that she's well versed in, and so I think she leans heavily into trusting what DHS says, and takes them at their word for, they're locking up dangerous people, which we know in cases like Denmark and Jovi and like countless others, that's simply not true. ICE benefits by painting our communities as dangerous so that they can incarcerate them. I think it's not an issue she's well versed in, and I think it's not an issue that her team is well versed in. So that when she hears from detractors who say, well, this might get challenged in court, her instinct is, well, it's for really dangerous people and it's probably going to cause a messy lawsuit. So let's just not do it because it's like too much trouble to get into. But the reality is that we know the criminalization of our communities is wrong. We know that like the criminalization of most communities of color is baseless. All communities of the nation is generally just like a baseless category that we use to throw people away. But two is that the Trump administration is suing everyone anyway. Look at what they're doing to Congresswoman MacIver. Look at what they did to Mayor Baraka. And I think we really need to push our leaders to not think so insularly about what the simple ways are or what the past ways were, because we're not in a past world anymore. We're in a world where we need to determine the fight forward. I think of Governor Newsom when he was like, yeah, come arrest me. Like that's the attitude that states like New Jersey should adapt. I do want to push our leaders to take more of a like bring it stance. And I don't think that we have that right now. But I do think we have an opportunity to push them because they're trying to get our vote.
And I'll just put one last call out to see if there are any other questions from our audience. You can feel free to come off with mute or drop a question in the chat box. And if not, I'm so grateful for everyone for joining us today, and huge thank you to our speakers for sharing so much information. To Amy's point of calling your representative